A 7,000-year-old skeleton was sitting in a lab in Stuttgart, Germany. Scientists had cleaned it, cataloged it, and extracted its DNA the way they had done with thousands of other ancient remains across Europe. This was supposed to be routine. A farmer who lived in central Germany at a time when most of the continent was still populated by hunter-gatherers. A data point. Another piece confirming the clean, orderly story of where Europeans came from. Instead, they cracked it wide open in a way nobody had anticipated. They ran the numbers, and the numbers pulled in a direction that made no sense. No matter how they adjusted the model, no matter which ancestral populations they tried to combine, something kept appearing in this ancient German genome that the existing framework simply could not explain away. A faint signal, persistent, unmistakable. They tested it against every data set available. It never disappeared. When they traced it outward across global data sets, comparing it against hundreds of modern and ancient genomes from around the world, that signal pointed toward Siberia, and beyond Siberia, toward the Americas. That is not a typo, and it is not a coincidence. What geneticists found inside a German farmer's 7,000-year-old bones connected Europe and the Americas through a population most people have never heard of. A group so isolated and so genetically distinct that modern science barely had a name for them until about a decade ago. This is that story. And by the end of it, the way you think about human ancestry is going to be permanently different. For most of the 20th century, the story of European origins seemed settled. Two groups, two ancestral populations. Mix them together in different proportions across different regions, and you have modern European. That was the framework. That was what the data supported. And for a long time, it held. First were the hunter-gatherers, Ice Age populations who had lived across Europe for tens of thousands of years, surviving conditions most modern humans would not last a week in, hunting animals and gathering wild plants through the deepest cold the continent had seen in recorded prehistory. They left no writing, no cities, no records of themselves, only stone tools, buried bones, and eventually, extracted DNA. Second were the early farmers, populations who migrated out of the Near East beginning around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, bringing wheat, cattle, pottery, and an entirely new way of organizing human life as they spread agriculture northward and westward across the continent. They transformed Europe. And when early genetic studies began comparing their ancient DNA to modern populations, the two population stories seemed to hold up. Hunter-gatherer ancestry plus early farmer ancestry, different ratios in different regions. That was the model. Clean, plausible, supported by enough early genetic data to feel secure. Stuttgart broke it. When a large international research team led by Iosif Lazaridis and Nick Patterson ran the statistical comparisons on Stuttgart's genome, the model kept failing, not slightly off, consistently, structurally wrong. Two ancestral populations were not enough. No matter how they adjusted the proportions, the genome kept pulling toward a third ancestral signal that would not go away. They tested it against every available ancient and modern genome they could access. Every comparison pointed in the same direction. And when they followed that direction outward, that is when the real surprise hit. To understand what that signal means, you have to go to Lake Baikal, south-central Siberia, 24,000 years ago. In the early 2010s, a team led by Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen extracted and sequenced the genome of a boy buried at a site called Malta in the Irkutsk region of Russia. They called him MA1, the Malta boy. He lived during the last glacial maximum, the coldest, most extreme phase of the last ice age. Ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. Temperatures in deep Siberia dropped to levels lethal to anyone without the right knowledge and preparation. A small group of humans could spend entire generations in this landscape without meaningful contact with anyone beyond their immediate community. The isolation was total. When the team compared the Malta boy's genome to modern populations worldwide, the result was so unexpected that Willerslev later recalled they suspected lab contamination and paused the research for roughly a year. only continuing once new analytical methods confirmed the genome was genuine. "The result came as a complete surprise to us," he said. That was not just one scientist being modest. That was a field-wide moment of realization. The standard map of global human ancestry was measurably, provably incomplete. The ancient DNA itself held up under scrutiny. When genetic material degrades over thousands of years, it does so in specific, well-understood ways. The strands shorten and fragment, chemically damaged at the edges and patterns be now used as a verification signature. If the DNA shows those exact patterns of degradation, it is almost certainly genuine ancient material, not modern contamination. The Malta boy's genome showed those exact patterns. It was real. What it revealed was a population geneticists now call the Ancient North Eurasians, or ANE, a group that had spent generations in deep Siberia under conditions of extreme isolation, small population, cut off by ice and distance from the rest of the human world. Over thousands of years, that isolation left deep, distinctive marks in their DNA through a process called genetic drift, a mechanism by which small, isolated populations accumulate genetic changes simply by chance. Variants that might be rare everywhere else become common locally, not because they were selected for any survival advantage, but because chance kept passing them down through a small, closed pool of ancestors. The ANE accumulated those kinds of distinctive patterns for thousands of years, and when modern researchers began looking for their genetic signature in populations across the globe, they found it in places nobody had expected. Here is the finding that changed everything. A substantial portion of the ancestry of most Native American populations, estimates from the original research range from roughly a quarter to more than a third, traces back to an ANE-related population. This was not what the standard model of the Americas had predicted. The dominant story said that Native Americans descended from East Asian populations who crossed the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, the region now submerged beneath the Bering Strait, sometime between 15 and 20,000 years ago. That part of the story is still correct. But what the Malta boy's genome revealed is that the group that crossed into the Americas was not purely East Asian related. They carried ANE ancestry with them. The founding population of the Americas was already a mixture. East Asian lineages blended with a deep Siberian component that, as it turned out, also connected them to the ancient populations of Europe. Think about what admixture means in practical terms. When populations meet and reproduce, their genetic signals blend. That blend does not disappear after one generation, or 10 or 100. It persists for thousands of years as a measurable signal in later genomes, readable the way a chemist can detect what pigments were mixed into a specific shade of paint, even if the original containers are long gone. The ANE signal persisted. It crossed Beringia into the Americas. It survived thousands of years of European prehistory. And it turned up in a 7,000-year-old German farmer in a way that forced researchers to revise the entire two-population model of European origins. But Stuttgart herself, the early German farmer, had almost no ANE ancestry directly. The signal was detectable but subtle. The ANE component that eventually became a significant part of modern European ancestry was not fully present in the early farmers who spread agriculture into Germany 8,000 years ago. It arrived later, and when researchers traced how and when it arrived, they found a migration so large in scale that it permanently transformed the genetic makeup of Europe in a way that is still visible in every modern European genome today. Around 5,000 years ago, something began moving across the Eurasian steppe. The Yamnaya were a culture of herders and pastoralists occupying the vast grasslands of what is now Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a corridor of open land stretching thousands of kilometers into Central Asia. Mobile, cattle-herding people who built wheeled vehicles and buried their dead under earthen mounds called kurgans. They moved fast by prehistoric standards. And they were genetically remarkable. The Yamnaya carried enormous quantities of ancestry, ultimately derived from Eastern hunter-gatherers, populations whose lineage connected back, through the deep past, to those same ANE-related people whose ghost appears in the genome of the Malta boy. When the Yamnaya expanded westward into Europe, beginning around 5,000 years ago, they did not arrive as a trickle. They arrived as a wave. A landmark study published in 2015 in Nature, led by Wolfgang Hauck, Lazaridis, and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Harvard, sequenced ancient genomes from Central Europe across a span of time bracketing this migration. What they found was direct genetic evidence of a transformation so rapid and so complete that massive migration was the only adequate description. People associated with the corded ware culture, the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age population of what is now Germany, Poland, and surrounding regions, turned out to carry approximately 75% of their ancestry from steppe migrants in the main analysis, with some model estimates reaching as high as 79%, not partially influenced by steppe migrants, not gradually mixed with them over centuries, predominantly descended from them in a shift the researchers described as a major and relatively sudden genetic turnover. That sounds like a detail in a history book. It is not. It means that the people farming in Germany several thousand years before this event, the people who built the earliest Neolithic monuments, who cultivated the first Central European fields, who left behind pottery and burial sites, and the slow material record of a civilization taking shape, were largely replaced. Their culture continued in modified form, but their genes did not survive in significant proportions in the populations that followed. A 2018 study in Nature by Olalde and colleagues documented approximately 90% genetic replacement of the British population within just a few hundred years following the Bell-Beaker expansion, the closely related steppe-derived wave that swept through northwestern Europe slightly later. 90% within a few hundred years. The farming communities that had shaped British and Central European culture for thousands of years before that moment left only a faint genetic trace in the people who came after them. The transformation across Germany and Central Europe, while documented differently, was no less striking within what amounts to a few generations in the archaeological record. The corded ware people of Germany were carrying roughly 3/4 of their ancestry from incoming steppe migrants. And those migrants carried something the earlier farmers had not possessed in significant quantities. ANE ancestry. The deep Siberian signal, passed down through the Yamnaya from those ancient isolated populations near Lake Baikal, the same genetic line that had also helped populate the Americas thousands of years earlier on the other side of the world. So, when you look at a contemporary European genome today, what are you actually looking at? A layered document, written across thousands of years of human movement, survival, isolation, and collision. One layer traces to Ice Age European hunter-gatherers, people who survived glacial Europe for millennia before any farmer arrived, whose ancestors walked into the continent when it was a frozen, barely habitable wilderness and made it home. A second layer traces to early farmers from the Near East, the people who walked into Europe 8,000 or 9,000 years ago and permanently transformed how humans on this continent lived and organized themselves. And a third layer, the part no early genetic model predicted, the part that kept appearing as an unexplained signal in Stuttgart's genome, traces back through steppe herders to a population of Ice Age Siberians whose closest genetic relatives, for thousands of years, were on the other side of the world. The ancient German skeleton was not just a German, and once researchers understood that, a much larger question opened up. If the same ancestral population fed into both the genetic history of modern Europeans and the founding populations of the Americas, not by direct contact, not by any single migration linking the two continents, but through two separate streams moving in opposite directions from the same deep Siberian source, then the connection between these two groups was not a coincidence or a measurement error, it was a record. A record of something that happened before either Europe or the Americas existed as concepts, before borders or nations, or the very idea of ancestry as identity had any meaning at all. Two groups of people separated by the full width of the world, no direct journey ever linking them. no single migration connecting the two continents, and yet the same ancestral signal, the same deep Siberian fingerprint, running through both of them, persisting across thousands of years, waiting in the bones of a German farmer buried in Central Europe for a team of scientists with the right tools to finally read it. This is what ancient DNA has done to human prehistory. It has not confirmed the old stories, it has replaced them with something far stranger, far more interconnected, and far less tidy than anything the previous century of archaeology prepared us for. The question of where Europeans came from turned out to be inseparable from the question of how the Americas were populated. The answer to both runs through a frozen landscape near Lake Baikal 24,000 years ago, and a small group of people whose descendants would eventually reach every corner of the Earth. New ancient genomes are being sequenced every year. New signals are emerging. New chapters are being forced open in ways nobody anticipated. This one is just where it started. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next.